Hi everybody, welcome to this revision webcast on some of the aspects of the economics of inequality. I'm sure this is something, a topic, an issue that has been highly topical for all of you, but both at AS and A2 over the last year or two. Just in the last year or so, we've had several notable new books published, including Capital by Thomas Piketty. And actually, there's a new book out on inequality by the legendary Professor A.B. Atkinson, which I'll mention at the end of this webcast. There's been a huge amount of media interest, academic inquiry, and student engagement with the whole topic of inequality. So it's impossible for me to cover everything in 15, 20 minutes. But what I'll try and do is try and capture for you some of what I think are some of the big issues and some of the sort of underlying trends that are pertinent to this debate. One of my favourite economists is the erstwhile professor of economics at Princeton, Professor Angus Deaton, an eminent economic historian and purveyor of marvellous bow ties. And I heard him speak a few months ago at the LSE at a talk. He's written a new book on inequality, and he raised the question of what do we mean by inequality? What does equality mean? Are we trying to measure income? Are we trying to measure wealth? Are we trying to measure people's life chances? Are we trying to measure people's consumption? So when we talk about inequality, it's not something that's capable of a single definition or a single measure, although we do have measures of inequality. And one of them is something called the Gini coefficient, and we'll come back to that in a few seconds. One of the underlying questions, oftentimes in an exam, is you get asked, analyze or assess the underlying causes of growing inequality, either in the context of developed countries, rich, advanced OECD countries like the UK and Germany and the United States, or often, particularly if you're an Excel student, the causes of inequality in developing and emerging market countries. What I've tried to do on this slide is just try and capture for you half a dozen sort of underlying factors that explain why economic growth in many countries can lead to higher inequality, or at best a sort of stable level of income and wealth inequality. Fundamentally, the first point I think is probably the one I would emphasize most, that what we see as countries grow and develop often is that the gap, the dispersion in pay and total earnings between different occupations and different sectors just gets wider and wider. And we'll have a little look at that later on, but there's a process called hollowing out, which is linked to globalization. And this is where we see the rise of very highly skilled, high-tech, high-knowledge jobs at the top end of the labour market. And they often pay a very premium wage, a very high salary. And that grows. At the bottom end of the labour market, we see the growth of relatively menial, often service sector jobs, which are low paid. But in the middle, the hollowing out process is that traditionally well-paid full-time employment, for example, manufacturing jobs or heavy industry, those jobs tend to be lost through globalization in many, many countries. So this hollowing out process is part of the causation here, that you're getting more people being paid low wages and a relatively select few being paid very high wages, and inequality increases as a result. Linked to this is the profitability of companies. We're 5 or 6 years on from the end of the recession, and corporate profits are reaching new highs. If you read the papers most days, you'll find that companies are achieving very high profits, unless of course you're a well-known UK retailer such as Tesco. But a lot of the companies who are making money, the returns to capital have gone up. A lot of the companies that are making good profits are actually using that money to buy back shares, to lift the share price and improve the conditions for the returns to shareholders, rather than distributing those profits in the form of dividends or in the form of interest. Actually, dividend income from shares is actually quite a good way of spreading the distribution of income and wealth, because millions of people have money in pension funds and in their own personal shares. Over the last 15, 20 years, not in every country, but in many nations, tax systems have become less progressive. The rates of tax at the top end of income have come down. And of course, as you know, in the UK, the government, as part of its austerity policies, has been capping welfare, cutting the real or the relative value of money benefits, and crucially making it harder to claim. So the tax and welfare systems in countries such as the UK, overall, by and large, have become less progressive, less redistributary. We've also seen over the decades a substantial, significant fall in trade union membership. In the UK now, for example, only around a quarter of workers are members of a union, and only about a half of workers have pay determined for them by collective bargaining. For many workers, for millions of people, their bargaining power in the labour market has, by and large, disappeared. And you'll have been aware, no doubt, of the rise of zero-hours contracts, many industries, and the significant rise in self-employment. In some countries, inflation has been a cause of inequality. One thinks of countries like India, other countries where, for example, at the moment in Russia, inflation is above 5–10%. And typically inflation tends to have a regressive effect, particularly if the cause is higher food and fuel prices. And you can't get away from the issue about executive pay and the bonuses to senior management. There is a wealth of evidence that in countries such as the States, the ratio of executive pay, CEOs, chief financial officers, etc., the ratio of their pay compared to the average pay of people at the shop floor has been getting bigger and bigger. So what do we take from this slide? I suppose I would take from this slide that inequality has many causes. And it's important to understand that many of them are linked to globalization, and a good deal of them are linked to kind of structural changes in the labour market. Here's a little bit of data on the UK, particularly if you're taking a kind of AS paper or an A2 paper in the labour market. On the left-hand side, some of the highest paid jobs in the UK in 2014. Average, so median full-time weekly pay in excess of £1,500 a week. And on the right-hand side, a very different story. This is full-time gross weekly pay for people such as dry cleaners and waitresses and people working in the catering industry. These are pay levels on a different level, and you have to work a lot of hours to take home a fairly small gross salary. I said at the start of this webcast that one of the ways we measure inequality is by using something called the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient is given to us when we create a Lorenz curve. That's shown in red in this diagram. The Lorenz curve shows the cumulative share of income that goes to different parts of the population. So down here in the bottom left, we have the poorest 20%, the middle 20% here, and the richest 20% to the right. Now, the more skewed is the income distribution, the greater is the inequality. The Gini coefficient is just a number. We take the area underneath the line of equality and above the Lorenz curve, that's area A. Then we divide by area A plus B. So if there was a Gini coefficient of 1, there would be no area B, there would be total inequality. If the Gini coefficient was 0, then there would be total equality. The Lorenz curve would be the same as the line of perfect equality. Now, another curve which a lot of students draw when they're writing about inequality, they either use the Lorenz curve, or there's another curve you can use, and I highly recommend you revise this, and this is something called the Kuznets curve. The Kuznets curve looks at inequality in a slightly different way, and it tracks the changes in per capita incomes measured on the x-axis here by per capita GNI, and our alpha and the Gini coefficient on the y-axis. Now, the idea behind the Lorenz curve originally was that as countries developed and they went through the phase of rapid industrialization and heavy and significant urbanization, then oftentimes we did see a rise in the Gini coefficient for these countries, particularly as rural poverty went up. But there might come a point, this is not inevitable by the way, there might come a point where the level of income inequality peaks, reaches a high point, and eventually may indeed start to decline, although there's no guarantee that it falls back to the level it's once at. Oftentimes when a country becomes better off in income terms, the service sector starts to dominate, and governments are sufficiently rich, the economies have a sufficiently large tax base for them to introduce and develop and expand more progressive tax systems and a bigger welfare safety net welfare system, both of which of course help to redistribute income. So the Lorenz curve is the idea that countries might reach a certain income level and have to accept a trade-off higher inequality. They might be able to reduce income inequality over time, even if they also grow richer at the same time. There's some absolutely fantastic data out there on inequality, and exam boards are really quite keen to use the information that's available. This chart is taken from the work of Max Rosa at the Institute for Economic Thinking, based in Oxford. And let me just pick out a couple of the bits. If you look at the top of the chart, tracking since 1950, the earnings of the top decile as a percentage of the median income have gone up. The top decile is the richest kind of 10% of income earners. And the latest figures, if you take their incomes as a percentage of median incomes, okay, it's nearly twice. So if you're earning twice the median income, that is going to put you in the top 10% of income earners in the UK. Moving down the curve, the Gini coefficient has been rising. So follow the green line here, during the 70s and 80s, there was quite a significant rise in the Gini coefficient. Income inequality in the UK certainly increased. And it's continued to rise. Although just in the last couple of years, it seems as if inequality in the UK, if we take equivalised household income, disposable income, inequality may have started to fall. Now down at the bottom of the chart, again, a really interesting idea that if you take the share of income of the top 0.1% in gross income, again, a trend rise until recently, a little bit of a dip there. But even in 2012, the top 1% of households are taking something like 12, 13, 14% of gross income. There's clearly a lot of inequality in the UK. If we look at a slightly wider field, and look at the Gini coefficient for a range of countries. The bar chart shows the level in 1990, the dot shows the level in 2010, and for most countries, income inequality has gone up, for most countries, but not for all. And Chile and Brazil are two countries where income inequality has fallen in the last 20 years. Likewise, a little bit in Turkey and Thailand. So it's not inevitable that income inequality always rises. And this chart is an attempt to effectively to map the Kuznets curve. And again, the red line here is China. So China's income inequality rising sharply. It seems to have flatlined. Indeed, it's now starting to fall. Likewise, Thailand has seen a fall in income inequality, the light blue there. Malaysia has seen over time a fall in income inequality. So it's not inevitable that inequality always rises, particularly if governments are willing and able to introduce so-called inclusive growth strategies or pro-growth development policies along the way. China is obviously a fascinating country in all kinds of different ways. This is the official data published on income inequality in China. And albeit from a high level, the Gini coefficient is starting to fall. The latest figures we have are that it's about 47 or 0.47. So the next question is whether inequality is bad for growth, bad for development. And of course, this is a debate that students will be asked to think about and analyse and dissect and discuss. My own view is that inequality beyond a certain level is bad for growth, it's bad for development. I think if one's looking at, clearly it depends on the stage of economic development for a particular country. But there's a risk, there's a danger that very high inequality causes a self-perpetuating, self-reinforcing poverty cycle. Those with the least economic resources are less able to access the basic healthcare and the basic education that people need. Equally, a lot of people on low incomes have volatile incomes. One thinks of farm incomes being poor, being volatile, and they're more susceptible to falling into debt. They also have far less savings to use as a buffer stock when times get tough. Another kind of strand, another kind of argument is that inequality can lead to allocative inefficiencies, that the scarce resources we have may be misallocated. An example that I would use is that in a market economy, resources flow to where demand is greatest, and then the preferences of the rich can be expressed in dollar terms or pounds, so that the investment that goes into mega yachts or the world's biggest barbecue or luxury housing or luxury hotels, and that is where the money flows. And there are plenty of societies where you can see that in very stark terms. One has to ask the question is whether that's the best use of scarce resources. Crucially, also at the bottom end of the income scale, people need assets, they need collateral, they need something upon which maybe to take out a loan to start a business. And if people don't have that money, it's much harder for them to become entrepreneurial or enterprising. And then there's a kind of wider issues that we see embodied in, for example, the Occupy movement, which became so topical and so important in the States and in other countries around 4 or 5 years ago. That in countries where incomes are rising, but inequality is also increasing, the social pressures, the political tensions pick up, and that can often lead to unrest and threats to democracy. High inequality is also linked with much greater pressure on state welfare systems. People who can't afford a pension are reliant on benefits. People who find it hard to rent a home are reliant on housing benefit. In that sense, there are some externalities from inequality which affect everybody, because taxpayers have to pay more for funding the support systems for people at the bottom or low end of the economic food chain, if you like. And then there are other issues that they're all part of the same argument, I suppose, but oftentimes in countries where inequality is high, we see the rise of the informal economy, shadow markets, black markets, cash in hand transactions. Makes it harder for governments to collect the official tax revenues. We also see financialization happening, so the rise of the payday lenders, the rise of the pawn shops, charging very, very high interest rates for those people least able to afford them. Of course, it's a reality that people on lowest incomes pay the highest interest rates on debt. Now, there's been quite a bit of evidence coming through in the last year or two about whether inequality does harm growth. The OECD came out with a report at the turn of the year suggesting that even for developed countries, the Gini coefficient goes up. It's just enough to shave maybe less than 0.5% per year from the GDP growth rate. But if you accumulate the loss of GDP over a 20 or 25 year period, you could be saying that UK GDP is maybe 10% lower than it might have been had inequality been less. And there's a chance of the Exchequer looking to balance the books. If GDP was 10% bigger, that would be a lot more tax revenue. And we're starting to see the mood music change in policy circles as well. Even that bastion of left-wing contrarian thinking, IMF, is now saying that inequality can be damaging. Here we have a quote from Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF. Excessive inequality makes capitalism less inclusive, stops people from participating, developing their potential. And then I've just taken out a section from their latest report, looking at the IMF countries, 170 countries plus over the last 50 years. More unequal countries tend to have lower growth and less sustainable growth. So there's a kind of weight of opinion which argues that inequality is bad for countries, but you've got to evaluate, you've got to provide alternative arguments, and I'm happy to do so. There's plenty of theory that says that inequality creates incentives, that you need rewards in the pay ladder for people to become more productive and to become more efficient. There's a theory called tournament theory, which argues that you need the super pay right at the top to encourage the mass of people who are entering a tournament at the bottom. So think golf tournaments, think tennis tournaments, think the rewards to the supercharged, super paid players in the Premier League. Equally, you also need incentives to take to earn higher incomes, to take risks as entrepreneurs, to take a degree. So the labour market and the economies largely run on incentives, and a level of inequality or an even reward is needed for that. And then there's the argument for developing countries that a certain level of inequality helps to build up the demand for certain consumer goods, cars, washing machines, freezers. And once you have sufficient demand, the scale economies kick in, the unit cost of production come down, and then that makes these products more affordable for people on lower incomes. So when it's possible to justify a certain level of inequality. Well, finally, we're going to move on to look at sort of policies that might be used to either put a cap on inequality or to actually try and reduce it, to get the Gini coefficient coming down. I think fundamentally one has to think long term. The main causes of inequality are structural, and therefore the policies that you have to develop and put in place need to be structural as well. A lot of emphasis at the moment on human capital investment in both developed and developing countries. And this is the idea of increasing the rate of school enrollment and improving the quality of teaching, particularly in rural areas in some of the lower income countries of the world. In the UK, for example, big debates at the moment about which political parties have the best plan and the best policies for improving early years education, nursery education, and getting childcare, the quality of childcare to improve and become more affordable so that more women can go back to work. And of course, there's a whole debate about tuition fees and about access to the best universities and also the quality of vocational education and apprenticeships. And it's clear that countries that get these kind of policies right are putting themselves in a strong position to address some of the structural causes of unemployment, low wages, and ultimately inequality. And in some countries, governments have deliberately introduced what's called pro-poor growth policies. That tends to be in countries such as Brazil, increasingly in countries such as China, where, for example, they could introduce a basic income guarantee for people to give everybody a kind of underlying base of spending power. In Brazil, they've introduced a system of conditional cash transfers as part of the welfare state. Now, these aren't the dominant form of welfare, but for example, mothers who have their children immunized stand to receive more cash benefits, and families who manage to get their kids to stay in school likewise get a financial incentive. So pro-poor growth policies are an attempt to kind of mix conditionality with cash incentives. And then there's a whole other series of policies, and typically in an exam you'd only have time to analyze and evaluate 3 or 4 of them. If you're in the developing economic revision mode at the moment, things like microfinance, microinsurance, and other schemes designed to empower enterprise in low-income countries. In the UK, a huge debate about how we can get more businesses to sign up to the living wage as opposed to the minimum wage. Some parties are thinking of introducing tougher controls on executive pay and getting shareholders and AGMs to be slightly more rigorous in how they set pay. And there's a whole debate around housing, the cost of renting, the chronic shortages of housing as a cause of poverty and inequality in the UK. And even fundamentally, the cost of transport, the cost of getting to and from work, for example, in countries where transport is both poor and expensive. There's the slide on the living wage. I think it's a really important issue. I'm a supporter of the living wage. It's a very topical issue. If you want to find out more about it, the Living Wage Foundation is the place to go. Quite a few companies now taking out adverts in the papers saying they're paying the minimum wage. Just in terms of the background here, the blue is the living wage, estimated living wage, just under £8 in the UK. The minimum wage in the UK, which goes up again later on this year, is around £6.50. So there's a whole debate about how high the minimum wage should be, and also encouraging optionally more companies to take up the living wage. I mentioned the Professor A.B. Atkinson towards the start of my webcast. He is perhaps one of the most eminent living economists, one of the world's greatest experts on inequality. And he's written a new book looking at inequality and poverty in the UK. I've just drawn from that book 4 of his ideas, 4 of his policy prescriptions for addressing the issue. Now, he would argue, and this of course involves a value judgment, his argument is that you should move to a much more progressive income tax system. So he would, for people on the top 1% of incomes, of course that would vary from year to year, he would argue that they should pay 65% marginal rate. The current rate is 45%. He thinks the government should guarantee employment at the living wage, so effectively replacing a minimum wage with a living wage. And he's also got to focus on savings. A lot of people rely on savings to fund their lifestyles, pensioners who've built up their savings over time. And at the moment, with interest rates being extremely low, negative in real terms, those people are suffering quite badly. And so there's been a rise of pensioner poverty for those people in recent times. So perhaps the government could subsidise and guarantee, let's say, a plus 2% real interest rate on savings. And then his final point is really quite interesting. And this is where micro meets macro. That in many markets, we have the accusations of monopoly power, of rip-off pricing, of collusion and cartels, be it in utilities, or be it in telecommunications, or be it in the retail space. So his argument is that a tougher competition policy, which kind of attacks the monopoly power, the market power in lots of different sectors, that could actually be quite a powerful force for reducing inequality over time, because it brings down monopoly profits and it should reduce real price levels for millions of people on average or below average incomes. So A.B. Atkinson is an interesting economist. I certainly recommend you do a little bit of Google searching on him over the next couple of weeks. And if you're interested in development economics, one of the great books of recent times is by Esther Duflo. It's called Poor Economics. She favours randomized control testing to see what really works. There's no silver bullet for reducing poverty and inequality. Find the projects which work, find those which are most cost effective, and then see if they can be spread more widely across different countries. This has been a revision webcast on aspects of inequality. I hope you found it useful. Stay tuned on the website for news of more webcasts and more revision seminars. I'm happy to keep the conversation going on Twitter and other forms of social media. But for now, thank you for joining me.